Here is a claim you have heard, maybe from a novel, maybe from a documentary, maybe from a friend who read one. In the year 325, a Roman emperor gathered a room full of bishops, and in that room they took a man, a traveling Jewish teacher, a mortal prophet, and by a narrow show of hands they voted him into a god. Same meeting, they say, the emperor handpicked which gospels you are allowed to read and burned the rest. So the story goes that the divinity of Jesus was not revealed, it was legislated. A political committee invented Christianity's central claim, and everything after is just a very long cover story. It is a thrilling idea. It is the engine of the Da Vinci Code. And it has one problem. Almost every checkable detail of it is false. Not exaggerated, not spun, false on the record, and we can show you the texts. But here is what makes this worth your next 20 minutes. The unease underneath the myth, the suspicion that power had its hand on the faith, is not crazy. It is pointing at something real, just not the thing people think, and not in the year they think. So we are going to do both. We are going to debunk the costume, and we are going to defend the body, and we are not going to flatter the empire while we do it. This is the foundation of Asha, sourced religious history. Every claim rests on a text you can open. Older than Abraham, truer than Rome. Let us go to the year 325 and find out what actually happened. Picture the setting. Constantine has just defeated Licinius and taken the eastern half of the empire. He is the first Roman emperor to back the Christians, and his new church is tearing itself apart over a fight he barely understands and badly wants to end. The fight has a name. The Arian controversy. It starts with an Alexandrian priest named Arius, and his slogan is sharp enough to chant. There was when he was not. Arius taught that the Son, the divine word, had a beginning. That he was the first and highest of all created things, but still a creature, made from nothing, lesser than the Father. On the other side stood his own bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, and a young deacon you will hear about all night, Athanasius. They said the Son had no beginning, that he was eternally God in the fullest sense. Now hold on to the most important sentence in this whole video. Both sides already worshiped Jesus as divine. This was not a debate about whether to deify a man. It was an in-house family argument inside a church that already prayed to Christ, about how, exactly, the Son relates to the Father. Created or uncreated? Begotten in time, or begotten outside of time? That is the question on the table in 325, according to the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology and Britannica's account of the Council. Hold that distinction. How, not whether. Because the whole popular myth is built on getting that one word wrong. Myth number 1. Constantine and his council invented the divinity of Jesus. Before Nicaea he was a mortal prophet. The evidence against this is not subtle, and it does not come from defensive theologians. Start with a hostile witness. Around the year 112, more than 2 centuries before Nicaea, the Roman governor Pliny the Younger writes to the Emperor Trajan, letter 10.96, describing these strange Christians he is interrogating. They meet before dawn, he reports, and sing a hymn to Christ as to a god. Carmenque Christo quasi deo dicere. That is a pagan administrator, no friend of the faith, telling Rome that Christians already worship Jesus as divine. Go a few years earlier. Ignatius of Antioch, around 107 to 110, on his way to be killed, casually calls Jesus our God, Theos, again and again, not arguing for it, assuming it. Earlier still, the texts themselves. The Gospel of John opens, the Word was God. Thomas falls before the risen Christ and says, My Lord and my God. And the hymn in Philippians 2, which many scholars judge to be older than Paul's own letter, sings of one who was in the form of God and receives the worship of every knee. Even the skeptic Bart Ehrman, no apologist, says it plainly. Nicaea did not decide whether Jesus was divine. Everyone in the room already believed that. The divinity is old. 2 centuries older than the council that supposedly invented it. So if the council did not invent the divinity, what did it actually decide? One word. Homoousios. Of the same substance. Consubstantial. The bishops who opposed Arius needed language that would slam the door on any reading of the Son as a creature, and they reached for a term that, crucially, is not in the Bible. The Creed of 325 declares the Son true God from true God, begotten not made, of one substance with the Father. And then it does something blunt. It attaches anathemas, formal condemnations, against the exact Arian slogans. There was when he was not. He came to be from nothing. Those phrases are named and cursed in the text. Now here is the honest nuance our brand has to make, because we do not do tidy. That word homoousios was itself controversial in the room. It had a troubled history, earlier associations with heresy, and even non-Arians like Eusebius of Caesarea were uneasy signing it. And to be fully fair, the precise Trinitarian grammar Nicaea fixed was genuinely new work. Respected earlier fathers like Origen and Tertullian had subordinated the Son to the Father in ways the later Church judged inadequate. So Nicaea did not invent the belief, but it did do real, sharpening, novel doctrinal labor, settling how to say the thing. According to Louis Ayres and the St. Andrew's Survey, that work took decades, not an afternoon. The divinity was ancient. The vocabulary to nail it down was being forged right there. Myth number 2. The divinity of Christ squeaked through on a close vote. In the Da Vinci Code the character T-Bing calls it a relatively close vote at that. It is a great line. It is also simply false, and the numbers are not close to close. First, the head count. The traditional figure is 318 bishops, but be careful with that number, because we do not fabricate even when it flatters us. 318 is a symbolic, traditional figure, echoing the 318 trained men of Abraham in Genesis 14. Sober scholarly estimates of actual attendance run lower, somewhere around 220 to 250, up to maybe 300. So flag it. The exact attendance is genuinely uncertain. But the margin of subscription is not uncertain at all. Of all those bishops, all but 2 signed the creed. 2. The initial Arian resistance, reported as up to 17, collapsed under debate and pressure down to 5, then to a final pair. Their names survive. Theonas of Marmarica and Secundus of Ptolemy, both from Libya, who refused the word homoousios and were exiled alongside Arius. 200-something to 2. Whatever you call that, you do not call it close. Now, an honest footnote, because it matters for chapter 7. That near unanimity was partly manufactured. Dissent carried exile, and men sign differently when their job and their freedom are on the line. So the lopsided vote is real and the myth is wrong, but the smoothness of the consensus was helped along by the thread of consequences. Keep that thread. Myth number 3, and it may be the most popular one. At Nicaea they compiled the Bible. They considered more than 80 Gospels, voted 4 in, and burned the rest. This is the load-bearing claim of the conspiracy, and there is no record of it whatsoever. The surviving business of Nicaea is documented. The Creed, the Arian question, a ruling on the date of Easter, and about 20 disciplinary canons on church governance. Search them. There is no canon list, no debate over which Gospels are scripture, nothing. The specialist John Mead of the Text and Canon Institute puts it flatly. None of the early records from the council, nor eyewitness attendees like Eusebius or Athanasius, mention any conciliar decision establishing the canon. And the four-gospel core was already standard long before. Around the year 180, Irenaeus argues that there can be neither more nor fewer than four gospels, and notice, he is defending a fourfold gospel that already exists, not choosing it. So when was the canon actually fixed? Later, and elsewhere. The first undisputed list of exactly our 27 New Testament books comes from Athanasius, in his 39th festal letter of the year 367. That is 42 years after Nicaea. In the West it was then ratified at regional councils, Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397. Where does the Nicaea myth even come from? Not the 4th century. It traces to a 9th century legend, the Synodicon Vetus, with a story about inspired books that jumped onto a table by themselves, later repeated by Voltaire and inherited by Dan Brown. A medieval miracle tale, not history. Now we turn, because if we stopped here we would be doing exactly what we promised never to do. Whitewashing power. So let us be honest about the part the myth gets right in spirit, even while it gets every fact wrong. Imperial power genuinely entered Christian doctrine. Start with the man at the center. Constantine was not a bishop. He was not even baptized, he would not be until his deathbed in 337, and by an Arian-leaning bishop at that. He was an emperor, and he convened this council for a political end. He stated openly, unity for a fractured empire. He paid for the bishops to travel and lodge, he changed the venue to suit himself, he sat in the debates, and according to Eusebius, who was there, the decisive word homoousios was pressed into the creed at the emperor's own instance. Flag the tier honestly. Eusebius is a partisan source and that specific detail is contested, but the convening, the funding, the presiding presence, those are not in doubt. And then the coercion. The two bishops who would not sign were exiled. Arius was exiled. And Constantine issued an edict, preserved by Socrates Scholasticus among others, ordering that the books of Arius be burned, that no memorial of him remain, and, in the text of that edict, that anyone caught hiding one of Arius's books and not surrendering it for burning would face death. The capital clause comes to us chiefly through that quoted edict, but the book burning and the exile are universally attested. The state put its thumb on the scale. And it did not end with Constantine, in fact it did not even stay decided. Here is the detail that should unsettle anyone who thinks Nicaea settled things by truth alone. For most of the next 50 years, the supposed heresy was winning, because it had imperial favor. Constantine himself recalled Arius from exile within a couple of years. His son Constantius II openly backed the Arian party, and the great Nicene champion Athanasius was driven into exile 5 separate times, not by theologians, by the state. Jerome captured the moment in one stunned line. The whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. The pendulum swung on the politics, not the proof. It was finally slammed shut by raw power. In the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, and it made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It commanded all subjects to hold the faith of the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, and it branded everyone else, in its own words, demented and insane, heretics subject to punishment. The next year, the Council of Constantinople in 381 finalized the creed most of you actually recite, the longer version with the fuller clause on the Holy Spirit, and it did so after Theodosius emptied the room of Arian bishops and seized their churches. Then the Theodosian Code wrote dissent into standing law. Heretics lost the right to assemble, to build, to inherit, and in the harshest provisions were treated as guilty of treason against the state. The losers were not refuted. They were legislated out of existence and erased from the record. So who is right? Let us hold both halves at once, because the truth is the tension between them. Dan Brown is wrong on every specific you can check. Jesus was worshipped as divine for 2 centuries before Nicaea, by Pliny's witness and Ignatius's letters and John's Gospel. The vote was not close, it was something like 200 to 2. And the Bible was not compiled there. The canon was fixed decades later by Athanasius and the African councils, and the Gospel of 4 was already old when Nicaea met. On the facts, the myth collapses. And yet, the instinct underneath the myth, that political power shaped which Christianity won, is not paranoia. It is history. It just happened differently, and later, than the story claims. The myth says the empire invented the belief. The record says the empire enforced one party's version of an existing belief, with exile, with fire, and eventually with the criminal law. That is the difference between the costume and the body. The costume is the conspiracy, an emperor conjuring a god from a committee in a single afternoon. Strip it off and it falls apart in your hands. The body underneath is harder and more honest. An ancient devotion to Christ as divine, real and pre-imperial, that was then captured, sharpened, and weaponized by a throne that had discovered religion was useful. The myth confuses inventing a faith with enforcing one. Defend the body. Debunk the costume. Refuse to do either by lying. Here is the verdict, stated as plainly as we can. The Da Vinci Code is false on its facts and it is parasitic on a truth. The divinity of Jesus was not voted into being at Nicaea, it was old, and worshipped, and pagan governors complained about it 2 centuries before the council, more than a century and a half before Constantine was even born. The vote was a landslide, the canon was not on the agenda, and the man who supposedly invented Christianity died unbaptized until his deathbed. But the empire's hand was real. It convened the council for unity, it pressed its preferred word into the creed, it burned the books of the losing side, and 2 generations later it made one creed the law and the rest a crime. Both of those things are true, and a brand that tells you only one of them is selling you something. The myth is wrong. The unease is earned. So when someone tells you the church invented Jesus at Nicaea, you can hand them the texts and watch the story dissolve. And when someone tells you the council was pure, untouched by power, hand them the edict of Theodosius and watch that story dissolve too. The faith is older than the empire that captured it. That is the whole point. The body is older than the costume, and you can tell the difference, if you are willing to open the sources and look. This was the foundation of Asha. Older than Abraham. Truer than Rome. Open the texts. Decide for yourself.